To be honest, I didn't want to talk about 300 with my last video essay. So why did I go through with it? Well, it wasn't just for the clicks. God knows if there's one thing I'll never have to worry about, it's my channel getting too popular. No, it's because I only brought up 300 because it seemed appropriate to address it before today's topic, which is Battle of the Empires, or Conquest 1453, if you go by one of the more literal English translations of the original Turkish title. It's the biggest historical epic to ever come out of the Turkish film industry. A movie about what is easily one of the most world-changing events in history, the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. I like to call Conquest 1453 the anti-300, but to be honest, that's not entirely accurate. There are a couple of vague 300 influences in how the kinetic action scenes were filmed, but it really owes more to the old-school tradition of the Hollywood historical epic than 300. Mostly, you can see the 300 influence in how this movie was marketed to English-speaking audiences, which, well, okay, I'm not going to go into the subject of Frank Miller's politics this time, but all things considered, it is a little ironic. One more similarity Conquest 1453 has with 300 is that it's unabashedly a work of propaganda. Now, I haven't really talked about the topic of cinematic propaganda before, but propaganda really should be considered a more neutral term than it usually is today. It just has negative associations because of certain events in the 20th century. And in that general, morally neutral sense, Conquest 1453 is as much propaganda as 300. If anything, it's more obvious because its message is more specific. This is a story about the founding of the Ottoman Empire and, in a way, the nation of Turkey, and how this founding was a patriotic and noble event. On the other hand, 300 had a somewhat less tangible message about how Western society first embraced reason and liberty. I won't go into all that here. Just check out my own video about 300 to see what I have to say about the movie and what it reveals about the process of historical myth-making. Anyway, the reason I really wanted to watch this movie was because I'd never seen a historical epic that was told from the perspective of the people who actually held the upper hand. And to be honest, I just assumed this movie would show the Ottomans as the aggrieved victims, not the Byzantines. But despite what you might expect, Conquest 1453 doesn't quite play as fast and loose with history as 300 did. Now, please don't get me wrong, there's some pretty blatant messing around with the facts. And there is definitely a pro-Turkish bias at play here. But the one big thing that they do get right is that the movie doesn't present the Byzantines as the England to the Ottomans' plucky Scotland, or even really as an actual threat to the Turks. And honestly, it's not all that different from those historical epics British and American audiences are familiar with. Just, if you want to watch it for yourself, be ready for the 90s anime you rented from Blockbuster way back in the day quality dubbing.
You will keep that promise of yours for the remainder of your life up until your final breath. Or your death shall come from my hand. Who knows? Maybe that is your destiny.
But the topic of the fall of Constantinople is one that still resonates today and still has political ramifications. And there are still plenty for viewers on Team Byzantine to complain about, of course. Constantinople is depicted as somewhat richer and more luxurious than it likely was by then, for example. The Grand Palace of the Emperors, which at one time had been so large it was like a city in of itself, was mostly barely inhabitable ruins by this point. The city's population had collapsed along with the empire itself. What citizens of Constantinople were left mostly either lived in poverty or were wealthy aristocrats. Whatever mercantile class remained in the city were constantly at the mercy of their competitors, Italian merchants mainly from the republics of Venice and Genoa, who had exploited the empire's weakened and desperate position for generations. Even the emperors themselves were so broke that the last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI, actually had to beg the crew of a Spanish ship to give him a lift from mainland Greece to Constantinople to claim the imperial crown. This is a good point to step back and talk about how the empire that once had the largest and richest city west of China as its capital ended up becoming the East St. Louis of Eastern Europe. First, I should admit that by rights the Byzantine Empire should have been wiped out centuries before it actually was. Luckily, though, Constantinople was built right on the strait between Europe and Asia, giving it the perfect defensible position, since it was built right on the Bosporus, a waterway connecting the Aegean and Black Seas. Even more importantly, the city was surrounded by some extremely effective walls, which were built in the 5th century. The walls were so advanced, in fact, that in the Middle Ages the Byzantines lost the knowledge of how to replicate the construction. It's hard to disagree that these miracle walls were probably the main reason, if not the sole reason, Constantinople did not fall to an epic siege by the Arab Caliphate in 1717 and 1718. Since then, the empire had a long and turbulent history of ups and downs, fighting off invasions by Arabs and Turks from the east, and Franks, Normans, and Slavs to the west. And that's not even counting all the civil wars between rival would-be emperors. I don't want to go too far into the realm of alternate history, but personally, I think it's entirely possible the empire might have kept chugging along to the Victorian era and beyond, if not for what went down in 1204. It's a complicated and honestly infuriating story, but basically, a 4th crusade was launched to try to conquer the Egyptian coast to provide crusaders with a base to eventually yet again recapture Jerusalem. The crusaders got in way over their head money-wise, so both the Republic of Venice and a potential Byzantine emperor in exile, Alexios, manipulated the crusaders into trying to put Alexios on the imperial throne. It did not go well. Constantinople ended up suffering the worst fire in its history and was looted by their fellow Christians, who propped up their own Catholic Christian emperor in Constantinople, Baldwin of Flanders. Constantinople remained a burnt-out husk of what it once was and would never recover, at least not until it became Istanbul. Outside the city, the Byzantine territories fractured, snatched up by various rival Orthodox claimants to the imperial throne and greedy crusaders who wanted to carve out their own mini-kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Latin emperors were stuck presiding over a skeletal capital. At one point, the so-called Latin emperors were so strapped for cash they had to strip tin off the Grand Palace's roofs. You could have guessed that conquering a potential ally instead of your actual target hundreds of miles away could backfire so badly. Constantinople went back to Orthodox Christian control in 1261 under the Palaeologus family, who would prove to be the last imperial dynasty of the Roman and Byzantine empires, as well as the ones with the name that's hardest to pronounce. They never managed to get the empire back to its 1204 borders, which themselves had been a shallow echo of what the empire's borders had been centuries before. Also, the Christian powers of Western and Central Europe never gave up the idea of conquering Constantinople and handing it over to one of their own. And they were egged on by the popes who were obsessed with uniting Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, on the pope's own terms, naturally. It didn't help that the more the empire shrunk, the more the Paleologoi kept fighting and scheming against each other for smaller and smaller slices of the pie. And while the Byzantines dealt with all this strife from within and without, the Turks of Anatolia, who had come under the control of the family of upstarts, the House of Ottoman, were slowly gobbling up the territory right at Constantinople's eastern doorstep. Then they crossed the Bosporus Strait and started slowly taking over Eastern Europe too. And before you knew it, the Byzantine Empire was caught in the awkward situation of just being an empire consisting of Constantinople and a strip of neighboring land on the European side, most of southern Greece, and a few small islands around the Aegean. Even worse, their capital was right in the middle of Ottoman territory, which, well, let's just say if you were ever insane enough to try to play as Byzantium in Europa Universalis, you actually might have felt as hopeless as a real-life Paleologoi. From the Ottoman point of view, though, the conquest of Constantinople wasn't as simple as just sending over your biggest army stack, waiting some turns for your siege to finish, and then hitting the automatic peace offer button. The Ottomans had gone further than any other Muslim power had before by taking over much of Eastern Europe, but they were still a relatively new player on the scene. And in fact, they were almost wiped off the map by the Mongolian forces led by the infamous Tamerlane of that kick-ass play by Christopher Marlowe that more people should talk about fame. They knew that while the Catholic Christian powers of Europe didn't really give a damn if the Byzantines lost some territory here or there, or even if the Ottomans made the Byzantine emperors their vassals, which they did, taking over Constantinople itself was another story. It was very likely that the Kingdom of Hungary, who were still a powerful neighbor that could stand toe-to-toe with the Ottomans, would step in and potentially cost the Ottomans most, if not all, of their European lands. Or worse, the Pope might actually get his act together and convince at least some of the major powers of Christian Europe to take care of the Ottomans once and for all. The fall of Constantinople looks like a done deal in hindsight, but like almost any war, it was still the roll of the dice, even if those dice were heavily weighted in the Ottomans' favor. While the movie is surprisingly honest about who had the advantage in the conflict, it still does have a brave heart. You could argue it's Mehmed II, the Sultan who finally put an end to the Byzantine Empire, but the heart of the movie, its buff, handsome heart, is really with Husan of Ulubat, a soldier who just happens to know almost everybody and is able to show up almost anywhere. You'd think this is a character who was made up for the movie, but you'd be wrong, like I was when I first watched it. According to Turkish legend, he was the first Ottoman soldier to make it over the walls of Constantinople and plant the Ottoman flag, only to be greeted by a hail of Greek arrows. His story is almost definitely apocryphal, but at least he wasn't invented for the movie. He's real enough that he has a metro station in Istanbul named after him at any rate. So if the sources don't know for sure if he existed, they can't tell us if he looked like this either. He can bring his cannon before my outer walls anytime. No offense, Mehmed II. You're alright, too. Speaking of Mehmed II, I mean, this movie handles him okay, if how you would expect a film like this to handle him. The historic Mehmed II was a genuine prodigy who had some knowledge of artillery, technology, and engineering, was fluent in 6 languages including Greek, Latin, Serbian, and Persian, established a massive library, was genuinely interested in the ancient history and archaeology of Athens, wrote poetry, and had a court that included both Islamic scholars and Renaissance humanists from the West. What it doesn't touch on is that he was also a ruthless monarch who impaled on the stake 40 Italian sailors who tried to escape during the siege of Constantinople, and at one time executed ambassadors from the Byzantine Empire. Of course, the movie is no more likely to feature such scenes than a film made in the United States is going to depict George Washington beating his slaves. It's fine to show the brutal, dark side of history if you're doing a general period piece like The Nightingale or Mudbound. But unless they're a serial killer or a Hitler, it's rare to find actual important historical figures painted in shades of gray. You're more likely to see that kind of thing in a biopic. And even then, it's usually when the subject is a famous artist or something, not when it's a celebrated national founder. Unless it's Christopher Columbus, because, my god, fuck that guy. Oh, Mehmed was apparently bisexual too, and allegedly, at least according to Western sources, which would not be the most unbiased, had a sexual and possibly romantic relationship with Radu, who was none other than the brother of Vlad the Impaler. Yeah, you're never going to see that in a Turkish movie. As cool as it would have been if Radu had just showed up randomly and started making out with Mehmed. Instead, we get a subplot where Mehmed has daddy issues with his father Murad, because Murad was so serious about being a sultan, he was no closer to Mehmed than he was with any of his other subjects. So at the same time he's learning to conquer Constantinople, he's learning to be a good father to the son who would eventually succeed him as sultan, Bayezid. I can't say whether or not this is accurate, although I couldn't find any mention of it in the sources I used. What I can say with certainty is that this whole storyline is kind of sad if you know that Bayezid wouldn't even be his favorite son. That honor actually went to another son of his, Mustafa, who, to be fair, at the time of this movie hadn't been born yet. But what about Mehmed's adversary, Constantine XI, whose main contribution to history is the gorgeous irony that he had the same name as Constantinople's founder and namesake? Does he get the same treatment as history's greatest monster, according to Braveheart Edward I? Surprisingly, no. He just comes across as a dismissive jerk who isn't accepting the gravity of the situation, even holding a feast during the siege when, in real life, people would have probably been eating rotten food or their own pets. But actually, this couldn't be further from the truth. While his brothers mostly plotted against him and each other, to the point that he probably would have been immediately overthrown if not for the personal intervention of their mother Helena, Constantine XI had, even before he became emperor, focused on doing what he could to protect what was left of the empire from invasion. He probably would have even made a decent emperor, if not a particularly brilliant one, in better times. Unfortunately, even a Napoleon would have had a hard time salvaging the current situation. That said, though, the movie does get one thing about him right. Constantine XI really overplayed his hand. See, the Ottomans, much like the Paleologoi themselves, did not believe that sharing is caring. When a reigning sultan died, the surviving heirs would mark the occasion by going to war with each other. The Byzantines would take in one of the losing heirs and either let him go to cause havoc in one part of the Ottoman Empire, or politely ask the Sultan, "Hey, we have a member of your family who might try to usurp your throne. You know, we'd be happy to keep him under lock and key for you in exchange for paying us enough to make sure he lives like a prince. But if you'd rather not, that's cool. Just don't blame us if he happens to get out of the city and cross our borders and tries to start a rebellion or something." It's a strategy the Byzantines used with mixed successes. And it's just what Constantine tried to do with Mehmed's cousin, Orhan. Not only did he try to keep Orhan as a human bargaining chip.
It says here that Constantine would like to double the subsidy that we are currently paying for Orhan, my Sultan.
He actually requested more money for Orhan's upkeep. Mehmed received the request politely and promised to mull it over, and then started preparations to besiege Constantinople. Would Mehmed have tried to take over Constantinople even if Constantine had kept his mouth shut about Orhan and finances? Well, yeah. Even if you're a great conqueror like Julius Caesar or Napoleon, it's just good politics to make sure you have a pretext, no matter how flimsy. And to the movie's credit, it makes it clear that Mehmed wanted to invade Constantinople anyway. The movie plays up an apocryphal prophecy by the Prophet Muhammad that one day the city would be ruled by Muslims. And maybe Mehmed knew about that prophecy. But honestly, taking over Constantinople just made sense if you were an Ottoman Sultan. The last thing you want if you get yourself an empire is a heavily fortified foreign city, effectively splitting your empire in half by land. That's just asking for trouble. Not to mention, it just doesn't look right. But still, if Constantine XI was so competent, why did he basically give Mehmed a golden ticket to pillage his capital? The movie does chalk it up to Byzantine arrogance, which is completely unfair. If nothing else, the Byzantines were extremely aware of the horrible situation they were in. More so than these guys, I would say. In this era, you might still get an occasional grumpy letter from the Patriarch of Constantinople to a disrespectful Russian Grand Duke that, no. Things might look really bad right now, but the Emperor is still God's viceroy on Earth, which is something that actually did happen. But the last emperors of the Byzantine Empire were so desperate they traveled as far as France and England to beg for military support, which they didn't get, by the way, and negotiated to force their church to unite with the Catholic Church and acknowledge papal supremacy, which infuriated a lot of their devout subjects. So Constantine trying to wrangle more money out of the Sultan might have been an act of desperation, or it might have been because Constantine thought Mehmed's position was much weaker than it was. After all, Mehmed had lost his own throne before. Or it was a combination of both. Either way, the movie is right in showing that it sealed the Empire's fate, even if it does make Constantine XI look much more inept than he probably actually was. What the movie does get wrong about the Byzantines easily reaches English people in a Mel Gibson movie level, so. Another subplot in the movie revolves around Urban, a Hungarian engineer. Urban was a real person. The adopted daughter the movie gives him, Era, was not. So neither was her love affair with the doomed Hassan. That's all well and good, adding a fictitious average person who gets caught up in these grand world-changing events is a perfectly valid approach for a movie like this. And any excuse to get this guy out of his shirt has my seal of approval. What instead gets my seal of disapproval is the action-packed climax of the subplot. See, Urban first tries to sell his expertise in making cannons to the Byzantines, but when it looks like they're not able to pay him, they hold his daughter prisoner to force him to make his cannon. But Hassan rushes in and saves them both, and they escape to Ottoman territory. Hopefully, you don't need me to tell you that nothing like this ever happened. It is true that Urban did come to Constantinople looking for work, but when it turned out the government was too poor and couldn't provide him with the materials he needed, no one tried stopping him from going to the next customer, who happened to be Sultan Mehmed. I have to add this to my great big list that I have succinctly titled, "No, I really don't mind changes to the historical narrative unless they're really stupid and egregious." Feel free to show the Byzantines as complacent, even a little bit incompetent. But having them act like the Decepticons is not just bad history, but pretty lousy storytelling. But as for the main event, the movie does stay on the rails, more or less. At least it's willing to show it wasn't a slam dunk for the Ottomans, even though some historians estimate that the Byzantines were outnumbered by at least 15 to 1. But at the same time, the movie really lets its nationalism get in the way of its portrayal of the invasion. The movie strongly implies that all the soldiers in Mehmed's army were Muslims, if not Turks themselves. In reality, many of Mehmed's technical advisors came from Europe, like Urban, and the army no doubt had a large number of Christian soldiers who were either conscripted from the Ottoman Empire's predominantly Christian territories, were mercenaries, or were sent by the Christian rulers who were the Sultan's vassals. In fact, even the miners who tried to burrow under Constantinople's walls, as shown in the movie, weren't Turks themselves, but Germans who had migrated to Serbia to work in the country's silver mines and ended up enlisted in the Sultan's army. And the guy in charge of countering their efforts was John Grant, a native of Scotland. Funny how globalized even medieval Europe can be, isn't it? Anyway, like how Braveheart overlooks the fact that William Wallace slaughtered lots of civilians in northern England, the movie doesn't go into how Mehmed let his troops loot Constantinople for 3 days following Islamic law. That said, I watched this movie once before I did my research, and one thing I thought had to have been fictional wasn't. Sort of. Mehmed really did go into the Hagia Sophia and allowed the civilians cowering inside to go home peacefully. It's just that the people the Sultan encountered were the ones who managed to hide away when the soldiers came in earlier to capture and enslave everybody they found. Sorry, little girl, you may be safe, but your entire family was just shipped off to a slave market in Izmit. But, I don't know, even with exploitative scenes like that, it really isn't as gratuitous as I thought it would be. Maybe I'm getting soft in my old age, or Braveheart and the Patriot forever broke my ability to gauge these kinds of things. Whatever the case may be, on a 1 to 10 scale of excessive abusive history, I only give this movie 3 Mel Gibsons. It's definitely biased, and it's definitely propaganda. But if you're an American curious about how other countries construct their own national myths through cinematic fiction, you could do a lot worse. And my advice is, never watch this movie if you're on a date with a Greek person. Unless you want to break up or divorce or maybe even wind up disappearing.